How's everybody doing today? David here. Hope you're doing well wherever you are. Welcome to this week's Griscom stream. I hope the topic ain't too ambitious, but I want to talk a bit about populism, the difference between populism and working class politics, because it's one of those terms I think is used by people to mean a lot of different things, and I think it's actually very important to not only understand these things but understand some of the pitfalls because I think we are in a moment right now of entering into a political moment where it felt like politics had really opened up after a long time of it being very stagnant in the sense it was managed, um, democracies, Republicans, Democrats, um, a lot of people becoming more and more depoliticized and like real alternatives to the kind of status quo and a lot of the crises that we're facing felt like they were off the table. And in the 2010s, and particularly towards the last few years of the 2010s, it felt like politics had really opened up. And I think we're seeing something right now where, well, a lot of stuff is happening, right? The argument that politics is being closed is not that things aren't happening. It's the entryway for, um, the left for working class politics for real kind of alternatives to be able to be represented and have an influence over the government. And yeah, it's starting to feel like so while a lot of things are happening, it's starting to feel like we're entering into a period of depolitical depoliticization. And I think that if you look at some of the structures and ideas around populism, I think you can start to see some of the tendencies that have been inherited and created that might not be the most helpful in trying to avoid something that seems like it's coming. Is my microphone not okay? It should be fine. Um, y'all can't hear me? Okay, well, if it's off, I'm sorry about that. But let me know because it seems like it's fine on my end. My receiver seems okay. But maybe before we get into that conversation, I can troubleshoot this really quick. I did want to start with something fun, and I know people have already seen this, but uh, if you haven't, Mr. Donald Trump is back with a very big announcement for folks, just in time for the Christmas season. And I figured we'd give old Donnie a little bit of airtime to show us his new wares.
Hello, everyone. This is Donald Trump. Hopefully, your favorite president of all time, better than Lincoln, better than Washington, with an important announcement to make. I'm doing my first official Donald J. Trump NFT collection right here and right now. They're called Trump Digital Trading Cards. These cards feature some of the really incredible artwork pertaining to my life and my career. It's been very exciting. You can collect your Trump digital cards just like a baseball card or other collectibles. Here's one of the best parts. Each card comes with an automatic chance to win amazing prizes like dinner with me. I don't know if that's an amazing prize, but it's what we have. Or golf with you and a group of your friends at one of my beautiful golf courses, and they are beautiful. I'm also doing Zoom calls, a one-on-one meeting.
Better than Lincoln, better than Washington. I do like this kind of post presidency Trump just trying to chalk himself up to some fairly influential fellows. I mean, uh, what I like so much about that commercial is not only it's like, of course, Donald Trump is getting it into NFTs, and of course, Donald Trump is doing NFTs after that kind of ship has already sailed, right? Like after that has sort of lost so much public credibility over the past few months, Trump jumps in, and not only that, him jumping in the way that he's doing it. If you're watching that video, I mean, that's some infomercial shit, right? And you have to remember, it's because his audience is old as shit. Like they're not going to be able to understand it if they try to do fortune favors the bold kind of thing, like that Super Bowl commercial from was it last year? Jesus, um, yeah, he's he's going to he has to do it in this way that like is the exact same thing as like the challenge coins and bullshit that he sells. Um, Pretty amazing. So I'm just noticing. I'm sorry, y'all. I'm gonna keep my eye. If you just give me 1 second, let's get into everything. I'm seeing that I'm actually not getting the chat live. So just give me 1 second so I can pull up the Twitch too, so I'm not omitting everybody. Because what I'm hoping to be able to do here is talk a little bit about populism, some of these ideas. Um, that have been sort of on my mind. If you've been watching me both here and on TMBS over the years, you know that populism is one of those things that I tend to think about a lot, because it's something that sort of dominated the way a lot of people thought about politics. And the way a lot of people even describe themselves. And it's something that's extremely tricky and difficult, because it's terminology that's used by a lot of different people to mean very, very different things. So we'll try to do our best to make this as clear as possible. But what I'm going to try to do, we'll see if I'm going to be able to, is it'd be great if, we usually try to do these as like Q&As, but it'd be great if, I'm going to take people through some of my thoughts on this subject. Um, and and if y'all want to, feel free to jump into the chat with questions or comments or ideas or points that you might want to make, and try to make this as interactive as possible. I'm not seeing the chat in my main screen, so I won't be able to put them on screen, but I have both the Twitch and the YouTube up, and I'm seeing everybody there. um, Anyways, that's enough introduction. I think we can sort of jump into this, because the question of populism is sort of a fundamental one in politics, I find. It's something that obviously dominated a lot of the discussion. And just up top, there's a few things that are worth noting, that, like, in the European context, I think populism has a different um, feel to it. Not only because I think the movements that we might call populist in Europe are different from some of the ones that we've seen in the United States, both today and historically, but two, because in America we do have this history of populism in the sense of the People's Party in the 1800s. I think that people sort of have a warmer feeling generally in American political discourse to the term populism than they do in Europe historically. Um, so that's one thing, just up at the top. But maybe let's set it up like this. What was populism in the modern sense, in what we saw from like 2010 all the way to today? Well, really, what it was a gambit to try to repoliticize the unpoliticized, right? And there's all these arguments about these different variants of populism, left populism versus right wing populism. Um, we'll touch on right populism a bit, but I think the one that I'm more interested in is what some people would call left populism. Um, because what we're really talking about here is strategy, right? This is the kind of definitional thing that I want to really try to tease out to make this point that I'm getting at. So the idea of like left populism, at least, so let's just use that terminology. Left populism was, how do we repoliticize the unpoliticized? You start to see declining vote shares for the traditional social democratic parties in Europe, from like their working class base. And the project of neoliberalization, the project of, for example, Blairism, I think is a good example of this, where like the traditional parties of the working class started to turn their backs on their working class voters, and instead started really to try to represent, one, on the like the macro level, interest of finance capital, interest of capitalism, big C, um, but also pivoting more and more toward the middle class voter versus the working class voters. And we started to see, similar story in the United States, though the Democratic Party here doesn't have the same kind of history as, for example, Labor Party does. Um, but left populism was this hope that you could sort of shoot some energy back into politics. And I think the ones that are most successful and unique to populism are movements like Podemos in Spain, are movements like Syriza in Greece, and to a certain extent Corbynism. But I think it's really important to recognize that within Corbynism, there is the fact that they are operating within the Labor Party rather than sort of charting a different course, right? Which gave them some advantages and disadvantages in the long run. Now, zooming in here to the United States, right? I think most people would consider Bernie Sanders um, campaign. A lot of people, I think, would describe that as left populist. As we get further, I think that there's a lot of truth to that. Um, but I think that there's also some really crucial distinctions to be made. And so left populism is this hope that, like, if we do a different kind of politics, particularly one that is very media heavy, very much around a kind of charismatic or interesting, characters. You have Iglesias in Spain, you have Corbyn in the United Kingdom, you have Bernie Sanders in the U.S. That can sort of remobilize, demobilize people. You're seeing this at a time when you had not only seen the betrayal of some of these more traditional social democratic parties to the working class, but also a ruling ideology that the government's role, the state's role, is to sort of step out of the economy. Now, if you spend some time actually looking at the history of neoliberalism, the idea that the state vacated the economy is erroneous. They played a huge role. You saw that in the financial crisis. You saw that in the 90s and 2000s. But it was a different kind of logic, and it was certainly a weakening of the state's power to basically be able to command aspects of, like, the national economy. And I saw Glasshank says, "How do we raise class consciousness?" And I'm not going to tackle that now because I think that's sort of going to be coming up, like, throughout this talk. But again, I'm keeping my eye on the chat, so feel free to jump in with any questions or points that you have, and I'll do my best to try to respond to them as we're going. But, like, populism, as we might call it today, like in this modern sense, is something that comes out of, like, the weakness of political parties. Um, across the Western Europe and across the United States, right? And the reason that this is a very crucial question is because while I think populism did repoliticize a lot of people, the fundamental structures of politics, or more importantly, the lack of structures in politics that come out of populism, have started to lead us into an area where a lot of people feel one way about politics, are very angry about politics, are frustrated about the way that things are going. Um, but there's not really a space or place for them to participate in, like, an actual political movement because of the decentralized aspect of populism. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's just start nuts and bolts definition stuff. A lot of times I think people, when they talk about populism, what they mean is populism is the politics of the people, right? And, like, I mean, who doesn't agree with that, right? That sounds nice. You hear Bush talk about the American people all the time. The ability of politicians to be able to sort of pivot and speak of, like, this undefined group, the majority, though, is something that has always been inherent in politics. So there's a part of it that oftentimes people are talking, like, oh, what's the rhetorical style of a political leader? And I think that gets into some of the confusion, the willingness of the media to basically throw the label populist, all around on different people, certainly also adds to the confusion, right? Is Trump a populist? Is Josh Hawley a populist? So the terminology, I think, confuses people. But let's just get into it from, like, a socialist level, right? Looking at it from, like, somebody who has, like, Marxist politics. Is there a problem with using your political formation on a kind of theoretical level, moving from something concrete like the working class, people who sell their labor to a capitalist in order to survive, right? And because of that relationship, have certain things that are common amongst a large swath of the population. Um, Substituting something like that, while broad, is more concrete than the people. Does that start to create any kind of fundamental problems for politics? Because the fact is, when you say the people, you're uttering something, and the definition is implied, is contested, is something that you can read into that a lot of different ways, right? So you're moving from a more concrete style of politics, in the sense we're fighting for the working class, we're of the working class, and we're just talking rhetoric right now. Whether or not, like, there's an actual merit to those kind of claims is another question. Um, Moving away from a kind of concrete definition, or saying this movement is rooted in the working class, meaning people in a very particular part of the economic system that we're in, to something that is sort of neutral, like the people. And if you look at the theoretical underpinnings of left populism, um, people like Leclau, Ernesto Leclau, Chantal Mouffe, you see that there was this move. We've talked with Lillian Chicurcia about this on the program. If you haven't seen, about some of these weird movements on the left, things like post-Marxism, um, where there was this uneasiness about having a kind of defined relationship with the working class, and wanting, rather than politics on the left, to be about fighting for working class power, improving their conditions, and actually having the radical belief that working people should be able to control their lives. Um, that instead, the working class should be a member of a constellation of all of these other kind of social identities. Um, and I think there's no doubt about it, particularly in the case of Podemos in Spain, that this becomes something that has a lot of legs. There's a lot of interest from people trying to do a different kind um, of politics. But we have to ask the question now. It's like, where did that get us? I mean, in Spain, there was excitement that Podemos was going to sort of be able to come in and become an alternative. That ended up not happening to the extent that we expected. Syriza, probably the most interesting of all of these examples. In Greece, Syriza is like literally the coalition of the radical left. They come into power because of the structures of the European Union, because of the weakness of the party structure there, end up capitulating to the European Union, um, despite having the quote unquote people behind them. Right, there was this big vote about whether or not the Greece should accept another round of austerity from the European Union, and the people all came out and they voted no overwhelmingly. But the weakness of Syriza, the fact that it wasn't rooted, and not just in the sense of like what's in their soul or their hearts, but in the actual kind of like logistical way, was there preparation with working people to deal with what would happen if you tried to do, for example, Grexit, leave the European Union. That work hadn't been done. So the possibility of the success for Syriza was sort of written even before that moment. And you see it now today with some of the more disappointing um, votes that we've seen from DSA members or progressives in Congress, right? There is a kind of loose association with some of these structures and movements and groups, but there's no kind of structural relationship between, for example, like an AOC and a DSA membership at large, right? Um, like there's a nominal one. This is like, this is a member, this is an elected official who's endorsed by the organization. But I mean, what's that relationship actually look like on paper? It's a lot weaker than I think sometimes people are willing um, to recognize. Let me know. Is this making sense? Should because I have some historical stuff, but maybe I need to continue hashing out this populism thing, because I know it's hard to talk about, and I was really hoping to have this be more of a conversation than just like a straight lecture. I'm always happy to just go on and on, but I want to make sure we're all sort of on the same page. Um, Larita says, I feel like populism is a process by which the leader embraces edge politics to keep power, and exposes other members of the group to radical ideas. So I don't know if I wholeheartedly agree with that definition, but I think that hits at a couple things, and maybe this example will help clear some things up about what I mean by it. Let's use Bernie Sanders as an example of this, right? Bernie Sanders is, except for a few folks, a relatively unknown U.S. senator, independent, who is self-described democratic socialist. He rises up in a moment where the left was incredibly disorganized, way worse than it was today. And I think it's always important to remember how far we've come over the past few years. Bernie Sanders rises up and presents this kind of alternative because he runs in a Democratic primary, um, between a kind of Bernie style politics and the politics of like a Hillary Clinton, right? Really the embodiment of like the rot within the Democratic Party. And that inspires a lot of people to go out and support the campaign, to do grassroots work, talking to their friends and neighbors. I mean, Bernie Sanders supporters got a bad rap from some people for being annoying, right? Because they were highly motivated voters. They weren't just people who were making a selection for a candidate. Those were people who were committed to an idea, and that idea being trying to bring Bernie Sanders into power. So when I'm making this criticism of populism, and even talking about the history of the Bernie Sanders movement, I think it's really important to be absolutely clear on this. I think that's the right call in that moment, because what ends up happening, a lot of people become mobilized, become interested in politics, think that there's something that they can be doing. Um, um, think that that's something that that they like, that there's an actual power that working class people have, that there's a value in engaging in politics, that there's possibilities, there's hope, there's alternatives, right? So it was a really mobilizing thing, and I think that it was exactly the right call. But it was always a Hail Mary, right? In the sense that Bernie Sanders gets elected, he's going to be elected in a hostile Congress, right? Even if the Democrats win the 2016 election, hold the House and the Senate with Bernie Sanders as the presidential candidate. I mean, think how difficult it is for Joe Biden, a pure creature of the Democratic Party, to even be able to push through some of his agenda. And imagine now what it'd be like if Bernie Sanders was there fighting for, um, pushing for something like Medicare for all. So I think this gets to one of the fundamental aspects of populism, is that it's something that is very much attached to a leader, an individual, right? It has this promise of, like, as a leader, as a spokesperson, as somebody who's speaking for the unheard, I will be able to mobilize folks to, take control of their own lives. Bernie Sanders' slogan 2020, not me, us, right? Which was, I thought, a great slogan, but it was also a real challenge. And I think a challenge that not a lot of people took seriously. People sort of heard it as like, oh, Bernie Sanders, like, respects us as participants in politics. But really what that was, it's a claim that to be able to do this, you can't just rely on me. We have to be able to create some kind of movement that can not only mobilize people to show up at the ballot box, but Bernie Sanders would say this in speeches from time to time in 2020, like, if I become president, we're going to have to be able to be mobilized. We're actually going to have to force these things to happen, because Bernie Sanders, with his experience in the state, understands that the fight only really begins once you get elected into the halls of power, right? But this is like a fundamental aspect of what populism has been, right? It's very much top down. It's top down in the sense that it's coordinated from people at the top of a movement, in the sense of the US is of Bernie Sanders, right? Who wants to inspire and mobilize people. But the main ways that they do that is through media. Um, like, it's primarily like a media oriented strategy to politics, right? You talk about things, we need Medicare for all. People feel like they want that. They try to find some things that they can do, some avenues that they can participate in politics, and it's trying to build a grassroots structure um, from the top to the bottom, right? In the sense of Bernie Sanders, like, we need the structure, we need you guys to do this. And I'm just going to continue to, like, use the power and the influence that I have in politics, and the ability I have to be in the media, to be able to sort of push folks to create this kind of thing. And again, I think it's a very worthwhile strategy, but it has a lot of pitfalls, and I think we're sort of living through that, particularly because Bernie Sanders did not take that commitment after he lost. Right, when he loses those presidential elections, the Bernie Sanders campaign wasn't really interested in trying to build a political organization that was able to stand on its own 2 feet, completely separate from the Democratic Party. You see the same thing um, in the many of the European examples. You see a similar thing in with Corbyn. Corbyn was a kind of long shot candidate that people sort of recognized there might be an opportunity to make him leader of the party. He gets in control of the Labour Party, but as we've learned from some of these leaks from within the Labour Party, he never actually functionally had control of the Labour Party. So he was still somebody at the top trying to push and mobilize people from the bottom to be able to create an alternative. And the question is, in a moment without socialization, right, where we've seen social lives of people really disintegrate, community really disintegrating for folks. Um, we've seen the betrayal that many working class people have experienced from these kind of social democratic parties, from parties like the Labor Party and whatever the hell you want to categorize the Democratic Party in the United States. Um, it's a tall order and it's a tall ask, and the really difficult thing is without that figurehead, a lot of the mobilization gets lost. I mean, I think we can, having done two cycles of it, the connection and the mobility that I think like the Bernie Sanders movement has is always going to be strongest when there's presidential primaries for people to organize around, versus moments like right now where that's not really on the agenda. Similar thing with, with Corbyn. When Corbyn loses control of the Labor Party, you see that structure, that mobilization really disintegrate and go in a bunch of different ways. Um, all right, I'm just going to make sure that I'm not missing anybody. And our friend Harpreet says the people who supported Bernie are now being led astray because while he did talk about the power of working people, it was a shallow analysis. And it says now those same people are being led astray by others who speak to their current frustrations. You need a socialist program that would give people the tools to carry on without the leaders of the program. And I think this really gets to the, one of the fundamental things. I wouldn't necessarily say the Sanders rhetoric was shallow. I think that it wasn't as strong as it needed to be. I think Bernie Sanders was really good at trying to speak plainly about these things, and I think that had a lot to do with his popularity. Um, but I don't disagree at all that like the political education work that could have been done in that moment didn't happen, and I think that that's why we're in a really bizarre and difficult moment right now. And I'll get Tommy has a good question here. Says, "What do you think about populism and anti-globalization?" I'll jump into that in a second. I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. I think Bernie Sanders was actually really good at trying to imbue a kind of class war rhetoric in his politics. Didn't always go as far as you would want to. Um, but I think that was something that was unique and special about Bernie Sanders compared to even a lot of other left populists that we've seen. Because if for people who've just been joining us, we're talking about this history of left populism, why we're in this kind of quagmire we're in right now. One of the things that I was saying earlier about populism is that populism, the irony about populism is that a lot of people, I think, correctly understand what happened with the parties of social democracy in Europe, understand what happened to a certain extent that was never as strong here with the Democratic Party after FDR, that there's a substitution of the working class, people who sell their labor, with the middle class. And talking about the people is a really great way to do that, because you can imagine and import your own ideas of what the people are, right, from a whole different set of political perspectives, philosophies, etc., onto what the people is. Right, the people is like an undefined concept. It's a concept of a unity. It's a concept of a majority. But what actually makes up the people is a kind of open, debatable question. And populism, so we understand that like the social democratic parties make the substitution and that's bad. But then in the attempt to try to rebuild and mobilize people in a period of political demobilization, there is the same kind of trap that folks fall into. It's like, we're not going to talk about class politics explicitly. We're going to talk about the people, versus the elites, right? Versus the privileged, versus the powerful, right? And rhetorically, I mean, there's a reason speechwriters like to do this stuff. It's good. It works. It makes your heart flutter a little bit. But there is a lack of political education that goes along with that in the rhetoric, and it creates a lot of kind of sloppy political understandings of why we're in this crisis that we are. And the fact that populism is um, so emotional in a lot of ways, right? In the sense that it's like the good versus the bad, it's the principled versus the unprincipled, it's the corrupt versus the true. Um, has also, even in the sense that, like, no doubt about it, Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton. Bernie Sanders is a good guy. Hillary Clinton's a bad person, right? I think we can agree on that. It's not that these things are lies necessarily, but it creates a very false understanding as to why we're in the crisis that we're in, right? Is the problem with the US system right now that the people at the top are just corrupt, are just, cynical, are just bad, right? You can throw all of those names at the folks in power right now, and you're not going to get an argument from me about whether or not I think that. But why is it that this system produces those kind of things? It's because it's a system that's set up to preserve a capitalist model, which allows the vast majority of us to toil and work for the wealth and privilege and power of others, right? All of these other kind of problems of corruption, of um, not listening to your base. All these things come from the fundamental fact that the political system that we live in this country and in many others is set up to protect the fundamental economic exploitation that makes up capitalism. And if you don't come into it from that kind of understanding, then you could think to yourself, well, we need is just some folks with good hearts, right? Because even if we have that moral arc understood, it's like capitalists versus working people, then you have to ask yourself, how does this change? And the kind of Marxist argument has always been that capitalism, because it is a system that promotes accumulation for a few and dispossession for the many, creates not only a numerical advantage for working people, it also creates, because of the system of capitalism, because it is dependent on the labor of the working class, this class is extremely powerful if they were to be able to flex their muscle and be able to work in a unified way, right? That's a kind of broad structural understanding of, like, the problems of capitalism, the problem of capitalist democracy, etc., right? Which is a very, very different strategic understanding than one that's pure moralist, right? Like, the people at the top are in bed with the wealthy, are in bed with certain kind of capitalist interests. But it's not just because of a function of, like, what's in their soul or their heart or all these other kinds of things. It's because they are in a position of power, and they look to the people in society who have power, right? And I don't think that what our job should be doing right now is convincing the powerful people to flip sides and join us. Um, but if you think that, the reasons we don't get the things that we want, we don't get the things that we were promised, is solely because of, like, a lack of will from folks, you're making a pretty grave political mistake. Make sure I'm not missing anybody in here. And here we go. Jonathan, I think, has a good line. Says populism is a tactic for selling a political program, not an ideology on its own. It's very fragile. It's useful, but it must have an ideology behind it. So, and I think that that's a decent way of thinking about it. It certainly is a tactic, and I think that that's why we can talk about different forms of populism, like what that angle of that movement is. But what I'm actually saying is that even as a tactic, it's incredibly limited, right? Especially after going through it, in the sense that, like, we didn't have any kind of political structures or mobilizations or things that seem very promising before Bernie, right? The closest we have is Occupy, and Occupy was another kind of learning experience, I think, for the American left. Lessons that you can learn from history, but sometimes you have to go through these processes to really get them. And I say this as somebody who, was at Occupy. Honestly, I was 18 when that started. I mean, I learned a lot through participating in those movements and mobilizations. And one of the problems with Occupy was that it very much eschewed politics, right? It was a protest movement, and one of the better things that I think has happened through the populist thing is that we moved, to borrow the term from Leo Panish and Sam Ginden, from protest to politics, right? Um, and I think it's really important that we don't fall back into that trap and continue to try to cultivate and build a political force. Um, Oh yeah, ideology and populism. But what I'm saying is that w- populism is a reaction to the failures of neoliberal politics, the disintegration of political parties, the disintegration of socialization, and it tries to sort of hop over the base building, hop over the organizing, hop over all of that kind of necessary structure that you need to build a successful political movement, and it uses like media strategy. It certainly is very good at mobilizing people online. Um, but what it has not, and it has successes. I mean, Bernie Sanders became a political force. Um, Syriza wins office and power in Greece. Podemos played a big role in Spain. Um, but what populism has not been good at least in the American and in the Western European sense, and I'm using again for people who just joined us, populism as a stand-in for this kind of these new left movements. This is very different from the American People's Party, which I think represents actually an alternative to this kind of stuff. Um, Populism was not very good at leaving organizations or structures or permanently mobilized people in its wake, right? So you see potential, you see opportunity, but it's one of those things that almost has to be reconstructed after every defeat. And right now, especially in the U.S., where the person who it's coalesced around, Bernie Sanders, might not be somebody who is going to run again in 24, certainly not in 28. We are in this kind of moment of trying to pick up the pieces, trying to find ways to rebuild out of this. And I think one of the important lessons for us is that populism is really great at injecting an idea into society. It's really great at sort of mobilizing people in a one-off way, but it's not something that can do the sustained work of building a movement. I mean, if you go back and you read Marx, most people they read more theoretical texts like the Communist Manifesto, or Capital. Um, but if you go and read Marx's political letters, I mean, he was somebody who was always saying this is a process that is going to take 10, 15, 20, 40 years to actually build these working class movements that are going to be strong enough to take power. And, populism was an attempt, out of extreme defeat when you saw almost complete demobilization on the left to like reanimate some things. But it ends up falling to the same kind of crises as we saw, for example, with social democracy. Is that like the rot at the level of the social in society, in the sense that like community, very vague term, um, um, people aren't socialized in the same way that they used to, right? People are very alienated, people are very atomized. This is the project of neoliberalism, right? Thatcher's line, like there is no society, there are individuals and their families, right? We live in that world today, very much so. And populism is an attempt to try to skip over those structural impediments that the left had, from the betrayals of the social democratic parties, from the pain and the decline in union movements all across the kind of industrialized capitalist world. Um, but yeah, it wasn't able to leave, to rebuild those structures. And I think we need to think very seriously, about why that is and how we can avoid that. But let me make sure I'm not skipping anybody. I see, and there's a couple people in the Twitch chat, and I appreciate y'all. I'm having some chat issues. It seems they're upset that it says we're playing NBA 2K3. Um, I don't know how to fix that. I'm sorry. Um, okay. Nuri York says, "Do you think neoliberal and Democratic voters are the biggest obstacle to real leftist politics? I've never been told by a Republican that um, I'm not thinking about minorities enough when discussing um, socialism." Well, I mean that. I mean, structurally, I don't think so. Um, is there a kind of popular ideology that is like comes out of the Democratic Party that is an obstacle to socialism? Absolutely. I mean, you see the way that they even frame universal programs as being, harmful because they benefit the wrong people, right? That's a very kind of modern American liberal story, um, which is wrong on its face. When um, universal programs are better, one because they don't create these kind of obscene lines where like, oh, if you are in this group where you make this much money, You're now not going to be able to get social benefits. Um, but even more broadly, it's like universal programs are just like are popular because if everyone gets them, you can't use kind of grievance politics to to argue to take them away, right? People want things like higher education for their children. Universal free college for folks is something that has a lot of popularity. The way the Democrats get around that is by saying, "Oh, we need to means test it. We need to separate and chop it up." And the people at the top are doing that for a particular reason because they don't want to see these kind of social programs. The way it gets sold to their voters is through this kind of halo of like, "Oh, we're looking out for those." At the bottom of society by making sure that rich kids can't benefit from these things too, but it's a kind of faux elite versus people discourse. So, structurally, the reason the Democratic Party is the way that it is not so much because of the ideology. It's because the Democratic Party is, one of the two gangs that controls the American political system, and they see their role as maintaining, capitalism, as maintaining the profits and power of the rich and of the capitalist class in the society. And the ideology is just like the story that they tell to themselves and to their voters. So structurally, I don't think you can focus on that as much as sort of saying like that's a symptom of some other things. Um, Adam was asking where they can find Marx stuff like Capital. If you can't find, and if you don't want to buy, you can get all that at Marxist.org for free, which is actually really great. Um, Lenny, I'm if you all saw my setup right now, what's on my screen, you would understand why I keep on getting tripped up. Um, my whole system messed up today. And sometimes I like doing these streams, but it's sometimes hard to do them as a single person, just technically. Lenny says, I always viewed populism as a movement rooted in reaction. Can you expand on why populism is reactionary? Well, I wouldn't say that populism is reactionary. I think understanding populism as more of a kind of set of political and rhetorical tactics sort of helps people understand the different ideologies that are imported into it. Um, as having a larger role as to what it creates. I mean, in the most broad sense, and again, as we've said a million times during the stream, like populism is one of those things by which that like people use it in a bunch of different ways. So it's sometimes hard um, to uh, to pinpoint and to talk about it fairly. I'm most interested in talking about left populism in this because I think it's something that we've imported, and I think it's something that we need to really sort of struggle with, learn what not only were some of the failures, but I think some of the kind of popular inheritance of going through a period of left populism as a lot of people's introduction into politics. Um, but I don't view populism as necessarily inherently um, reactionary. Um, to be honest, I mean, like I think you might be speaking of like a Bolsonaro or a Trump, but if you look at the function of what those movements are, I mean, those are movements of like the small bourgeoisie, right, or like the the people in the kind of lower ends of the ruling class, people who are, small to large business owners, have regional power, are frustrated by shifts in the national and global economy that have weakened them, and Trumpism was very much a reaction um, against those kind of systems versus an actual kind of genuine mobilization of the people at large. I mean, if you look at like who actually voted for Trump, it's very different from like the kind of media presentation. And it's not to say that there aren't working class people who did support Trump, but I think sometimes the kind of popular imagination, and I think there's probably a reason for it, is a little bit off from the facts of it. It's a similar thing with Bolsonaro too. Um, Luke has a question, and I don't mean to be snide here, but Luke has a question. What is it is about the nature of the online left that causes its focus on electoralism at the expense of labor organizing? Well, I don't think that that's a consequence of like the medium that people sort of engage in, as much as it's been, you know, union density in this country has been declining for a very long time. In a lot of places, it's very hard to organize yourself into a union. And if you ask yourself, if you're working in an ununionized place right now, the steps between where you're sitting right now and actually having a successful union that not only is recognized, but then the real fight starts, like actually negotiating a good contract for you and your members. I mean, it's daunting because the deck is stacked against folks. Um, so I don't find this divide sometimes between quote unquote electoralism and focusing on labor to be particularly helpful, because these are two things that you can do in tandem with one another. And also, like, if we're talking about electoralism and like the online left, I mean, what's the argument about the online left when people use that term as a pejorative is that, these are people who are sitting at home and tweeting and reading articles and doing things like that. They're not engaged in their community. To do anything successful on an electoral level, you actually have to go outside and talk to people and do that kind of work. So I don't think that you could sort of chalk up electoralism, to the quote unquote online left. If you want to talk about, what kind of strategies are best for like the organized left to be focusing on, I definitely agree that like the focus has to be building class consciousness and class power. And I think there's a lot of different ways to do that. I think that there has been a bit of a fetish for thinking if we can put our names by certain people, that in itself is going to, like, it certainly will build notoriety, but is it getting us out of this same kind of tension that we're on the left, where we have a disorganized working class, we have a left that is sort of in and out of the class. You still have those fundamental problems there. And I think I'm being more diplomatic, but I think I generally agree with this. Populism is political opportunism and ideological eclecticism. It's very dangerous. And I think particularly eclecticism is that. So, like, all right, let's very briefly, like, the left populism that we saw sort of become dominant on the left is, there's a lot of forefathers, or whatever the good term for that is now. I can't remember. I'm sorry. There were a lot of people who sort of theorized and wrote about it before it became major political movements. And I think the two that I know the best are Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau. They wrote a book. They wrote a book on hegemony. Was it The Logic of Populism? Laclau wrote, I think, in the early 2000s. And this comes after like the failure of the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? So there was this big question for socialists, for Marxists, because it felt to a lot of people like that historical moment was passing, and this is when you get the end of history, that the grand fight between socialism and capitalism is over. All the fights will be taking place within the kind of constraints of liberal democracy. And Mouffe and Laclau, are trying to work through this, and they come up with this idea that like the politics of working class versus capitalists is too rigid. It's not modern. It doesn't follow the kind of fissures in society in the way that are mobilizing and motivating people. So instead, they want to include the working class as part of this kind of constellation of social movements that can create a hegemonic force that can then overtake the neoliberal order that is in power. And a lot of people got really wrapped into this. A lot of people started calling themselves post-Marxist. This is where you start seeing class really becoming less of the central focus of the left in Western Europe and the United States, at least in the level of people who read theory and get into those kind of debates. and what you saw from that is just a further separation between left politics and working class people, and you see it in all of these kind of strange dynamics now. I think the NGO as a structure, which we had Ben Fong on the program recently to talk about. You should check that out if you haven't. The problems of NGOs in the left in the United States. It really became like the left became like a an extension of NGOism, right? Um, where the connection to the working class, the connection to that kind of fundamental economic struggle, the fundamental question of politics being about winning material demands for working class people in the short term, with the long term project of cultivating the capacity and the abilities of working class people to basically be able to govern themselves and govern their lives. That becomes a secondary question to a whole host of other more identitarian focused demands, and you could look at the history now as a very negative moment for the left. So yeah, the eclecticism that comes with populism, I think, is actually dangerous. I think it's fair to say. Joe sent I sent you a Discord DM with analogy. I appreciate it. I cannot open up Discord right now. I'm sorry. It's a little nuts over here, but I appreciate the super chat. If you put it in the chat, I will certainly read it. Okay, I have a couple. I'm sorry if this has been a little rambling. I hope we're getting somewhere here. Obviously, been thinking about this for a long time, so it's like I get um, I can easily start going into rabbit holes and lose the structure. If you haven't seen, I did a short Left Reckoning doc on what was left populism, and I did the history of the left up until the Bernie Sanders Corbyn movement. I'm still working on part two, and this was a little bit of a selfish way of me trying to revisit it to try to start. Um, putting together the structure of that second part to the documentary. But if you haven't seen part one, you can find it on our YouTube channel. What was left populism? That goes through sort of the history of the left, the crisis that left populism was trying to solve. And the part two is going to be what left populism was, and ideally part three would be what the kind of lessons that we can take from it. Is one of the problems when you work for yourself, though. You put things on the back shelf because there's no one breathing down your neck to do it. I appreciate the chat from our good friend in Australia, but I'm not going to say curse words on the stream. I'm going to get back to this, but I do want to answer this. If you win the sweepstakes to have the Zoom call with Trump, how long do you think he would last talking to you? What would you? Oh, if I was speaking with Trump, I don't know what I would say to Mr. Donald Trump. I tried to maybe get his business advice on growing our Patreon. I was thinking when he was suggesting that as a bonus for people who buy his NFT, which if you haven't seen, Donald Trump is selling NFTs now. I mean, those Zoom calls cannot be long because if you see the thing that's so funny about Trump, I mean, this does sort of go with populism, right? You look at people who are good with quote unquote the people, right? Lula being one of them, AMLO being another, Bernie Sanders being one. Trump gets accused of being a populist, but look at Trump when he has to like sort of engage with his voters. I mean, he hates them. He hates them viscerally. You can see it on his face. And Donald Trump is not going to be sitting there on a Zoom call with you for longer than 45 seconds max. I'm not a Mormon. I'm just going to shut that down. Where that came from. Yeah, I'll try to convince Donald Trump to join the MAGA communism movement. Okay, I know it's been a little all over the place, but let me try to get to I think some of the things that have been inherited, and I'm still keeping my eye on the chat too. So feel free to jump in there with anything. Um, what are the things that have been inherited from populism that I think are sort of plaguing the left today? I think one of the big ones is the fact that because populism is a mobilization from like a leader, right? Somebody who's speaking for the people, becoming the voice of the people. There's a tendency now to sort of look towards superstar politicians. Who will be the next Bernie Sanders? It's a question we get all the time, and my answer on that is fairly formulaic at this point. We have to stop thinking about politics in that way. Not in the sense that undoubtedly we need to be developing a roster of people who have the capacity, the capability, the understanding, and the skill to do politics on a national level. I think most critically now, from all the lessons that we've learned, they have to be very rooted, not only rhetorically, but actually structurally within a working class movement, within having a rootedness in working class institutions. Um, but this kind of superstar politician thing, it's like what we need is, if we had the guy, like you see this from some people who don't like me now, who act as if Bernie Sanders sort of talked a little bit differently, if he punched a little bit harder, if his media strategy was a little bit different, we'd be living in a different society today. And I think is, if you saw what happened within the Democratic Party primary, while again I think it was a very useful use of the left's time, particularly in 2016. We saw structurally they were one of the big questions in 2020 during the Democratic primary election was, will you respect the vote of the Democratic Party primary? Because there's already whispering that if Bernie Sanders found a way, to win, they would try to do something at the convention to take it away from him. So, like structurally, there were impediments there. But this other thing too is because that strategy is so media heavy. There has been this really bad tendency on the left, and you see it not only in the way that people talk about American politics, but you see it when people talk about other countries' politics as well, to overestimate the role of the media in politics. And I'm not saying the media is not a factor, but there's this kind of idea that if we had more on, like a left wing CNN, for example, in 2016, Bernie Sanders would have won the presidency. And I just don't find that to be the case. Um, you see that when people refuse to sort of look and learn lessons to what happened in Chile, when they had this historic opportunity to rewrite the Constitution, and the very same constituencies, the very same people, like the indigenous folks who activists were writing the Constitution for, they were claiming to write for. Rejected the Constitution that was written for them, right? And you see people, instead of trying to tease out the reasons why, the base and the kind of activist class that was able to write the Constitution in Chile weren't aligned on these things. A lot of times it's, oh, well, the media in that country is too right wing. Which can, it's like, yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, rich people buy media companies because they want to influence politics. But that's not the only reason that we're in this kind of structural crisis that I think we are on the left today. Even, and I'm not going to get into this stuff, I know this is a big thing, but even like, if y'all remember Force the Vote, um, well, I'll say, like, I wasn't enamored with the strategy or its possibility. I wasn't something I was, inherently opposed to, in the sense of like, well, if this is a strategy that's concocted by the people in place to do, I can see the potential logic in trying to win some things. I had doubts about whether or not it made sense to make Medicare for all a loser by bringing it for a doomed House vote, whether or not that was, mobilize would motivate and mobilize people instead of demobilize them. But again, I'm not even getting into the structure of that tactic. So much of the outrage about it was about will, right? Well, AOC, all these people, they don't have the willingness to fight for these things. This is, they're tricking people and demobilizing people. Well, how was that calculated and presented as a strategy, like via like podcasts and lefty media? And beyond the question of like the intentions of people who are in office, that's not a good way for a movement to do strategy and politics, right? I'm not even going to go into, I'm not even saying that the people who might have been pushing or thought it was a good idea um, were wrong in trying to use the platforms that they had to push it, right? Just assuming that, this is the thing that we needed to be doing at the time, which again, I have my doubts about. The idea that like what that the way the left should be coordinating itself is by having people in the media presenting ideas and then hoping that the elected officials pick those up is just wrongheaded. It's wrongheaded in the sense that the structures that need to be in place between an organization that elects people, between a base that elects people, between a working class movement and elects people has to actually be firm, right? Think about the railroad vote, something that I'm still hot and mad about. We can get mad at the tactical strategy of, people like AOC and Ilhan Omar, right? Um, but the the reason that happened, the reason that that's a possibility to happen is because there is no back cable between those elected officials and their base within the DSA. They were having conversations with folks. And was it, DSA membership at large? It wasn't, right? They might have talked to some members or whatever, but like as like an organization, is there that kind of coordination? There's not. It's an incredibly loose relationship that exists. And we can get mad at the people, who are represent us. You're not going to hear me getting worked up at people who are upset about that. I'm upset about it. But this is another thing where the anger, the genuine and correct anger, gets misdirected in this kind of thing where it's like, again, it's like, are these people good people or are they bad people? Well, what we should be asking ourselves is how are we structuring our movement right now, where we're basically shooting people off into Congress and hoping that they continue to have certain principles, certain strategies, certain ideas about how we're going to engage in politics, right? That's never going to work. You are always going to be disappointed, right? And it's not a question about what's in people's hearts or what's in people's soul, or what ideas they think that they're fighting for. That's an actual like fundamental organizational structural problem. And this is the like I think one of the frustrating things that has come out post Bernie is that the debates right now are whether or not like the progressives are good, whether or not Bernie's good, or are they bad? When what we should be asking ourselves is, after all of these years of work, of organizing, of dedicating time, energy, thought, and our lives to these projects, have we created not just like a rhetoric, not just a media strategy, but an actual political movement that has structures within it so that we're acting in a coordinated, unified way? That's the fundamental idea of socialism, ain't it? Right? That like we're creating a block that moves as one, right? Have we created that? I don't think you can say that we have. Do we have some bones that we can maybe build off of? I think yes. This is why I'm not one of these people who's like we should abandon, scrap, and start over. But yeah, the discourse of this comes out of populism, where it's like, what we're going to do is we're going to elect the right person, and then that person is going to deliver for us. When the electoral arm of a movement is only one aspect of it, and it actually has to be something that is deeply connected and within that movement, rather than something that we're just sort of shooting off and hoping is going to get us what we want, because it's not. And again, it's not because people are necessarily bad or they're grifters or they're trying to trick folks. It's because any structure worth its name, any organization that is supposed to be doing the incredibly difficult work of changing the world that we live in, has to be able to act in a coordinated fashion. And that has not been developed because we've been trying a lot of different strategies. And then I think for people who politics for them is something more that they view versus participate in, right? View or comment or argue about. I'm among y'all on that. Um, you know, I think one of like the nasty legacies of populism is that we do think about politics in this kind of ununified, individualistic way, right? Is this a good politician or not? Is this person aligned with us or not? Instead of what we should be asking is, what kind of organization can we create that acts as a mediator between the working class base and and their representatives. And that's one question. The other question obviously is, how do you create that base, because we also don't have that base, right? So things like, there's not an easy solution here, but what's frustrating to me is that we see disappointment, we see frustration, we see difficulties, and so much of the debate, I think, is around really spurious stuff instead of some of the more fundamental nuts and bolts of politics, of building a movement that can actually be successful in creating these things. And I'm sorry, I'm pulling up the chat because I want to make sure I'm not missing anybody who had the question or comment. But I mean, we are we are in a moment right now where there's been a lot of I think unexpected success, from, in the American case at least, and that's, I guess, what we're talking about right now. I'm sorry, friends, international friends. We're in a moment right now where there's been a lot of successes, from something that seemed like it had a small possibility of even moving the ball forward a little bit, and we got a lot further than I expected, and I think a lot of other folks expected. I think we certainly got further than Bernie Sanders expected. And there was a kind of strategy of like, let's try a bunch of different things and hopefully one of these things works. And now we are in this moment where we're having to sort of work backwards to create things that, if you were to be sort of writing a textbook about how to win political power for working people, should have been created earlier, right? AOC, somebody who has done a lot of good, and I think there's sometimes a very different perception of who she is as a politician, from her detractors and also from a lot of her supporters. I think if you look at a lot of the votes that she's done, I think that there are a lot of people who sort of get away with a lot of omissions, about like the role of that progressive well, I shouldn't call it progressive because that's too broad. The squad. I just which is like a brand. I don't even know who came up with that. That's not. Um, there should certainly be a Democratic Socialist Caucus at this point. Um, but that's the thing is, like, right now we have people who are representing the movement who have very tenuous relationships with that movement. Also, people who didn't really spend a lot of time within it. AOC was not a member of the DSA for very long before she got elected. So and then that time, like the political education within the organization wasn't where it needs to be. It's getting a lot better, but that's really critical work to be doing, and that's the kind of work that we need to be doing with candidates, I think, from the get-go. But even before cultivating people who are entering that organization and doing the work of turning people into socialists, from progressives, um, there has to be a stronger structure in place, to mediate between the base of that organization and the leadership, in the sense of elected officials. And that's just rarely what the conversation is. It's just like, should we be angry at them? Should we expel them? And expelling is a structure. But I think that's probably, something that's more of a last resort, than should be the first thing that's set up. And I know and also, like, just to be clear, there's a lot of people within DSA who are trying to organize and do that work. It's hard. It takes a lot of effort. Um, what I'm saying is not necessarily that there's not an interest or conversations that are happening from everybody, but I think a lot of the discourse around these things, a lot of the fights that are happening, a lot of the debates, omit, I think, the only real question. If you're interested in politics because you want a better world for working class people, I think these are the questions you should be asking yourself. If you're interested in politics, is just sort of seeing how you want to feel about people on your TV screen, I can't really help you. And I think Steve says one problem with DSA is it doesn't really have the juice into some of these communities to flex on these politicians. I think it's true that I think even with Bowman, and again, like the votes Bowman had done were unacceptable. Bowman was getting a bunch of calls from people saying he needs to support Israel, and he wasn't getting calls from people saying he should be supporting Palestinian human rights. And like that, I think gets to some of these more fundamental structural problems that are not the most interesting. I will admit, I know it's not the kind of thing that is the most entertaining thing to debate and talk about and think about. But for me, these are some of the fundamental questions. Tommy says, is anti-globalization a pitfall? How can working class politics promote democratic socialism while transitioning from neoliberalism? Well, globalization has been a process of neoliberal capitalism, right? What is it fundamentally? It's how can we undercut wages domestically while we can offshore work to other low wage countries so that we can make more profit? Fundamentally, what that is it's a very fundamental reality of capitalist logic, in the sense that what does a boss want to do? They want to suppress wages so that they can increase their profits. That's just fundamental. And if they do feel like they're compelled or have to increase wages, they need to increase productivity, to make up for that loss to their profit. And globalization was an opportunity for them to take advantage of it. The nation states were very weak in their willingness to sort of push back against the capitalist classes that were, doing that work of undercutting domestic workers. And it's created a lot of pain and hardship. Anti-globalization as like a kind of facet of the populist movement, and here I'm using it in the most broad sense, not the way I don't really like to do it, that includes the right. I mean, it's fundamentally a substitution, a substitution for class politics, right? And we've talked about it with some of the folks who are doing all this MAGA communism bullshit now. You'll notice they've stopped talking about capitalism as much as they're talking about globalization, right? Globalization is a process of capitalism, and when you substitute these things, it makes an implication that there are good national capitalists versus bad international capitalists, right? Which is, an abstraction with an intent of, confusing and muddying the waters, so that you don't have to do class politics in the same sense. You can just do an elite versus the people thing, which is like one of the fundamental structures of the populist rhetoric, if you want to call it that. But when it comes to globalization, I mean, I think that there's no doubt about it that setting up national controls on these kind of things is going to be an important aspect of building a socialist project. In the same way that capital flight will be something that we have to fight back against, right? One of the defining aspects of the system we have right now is the ability of capitalists to basically be able to take money, to take value out of a society and move it into another country when they don't like the kind of domestic politics in their countries. We'll need things like capital controls. I think there's no doubt about that. And this is where you get into some of the fundamental fights between liberals and socialists on these kind of things, because liberals like this kind of cosmopolitanism as like an aesthetic, right? A little sushi on Wednesday, Indian food on Thursday, and they don't like when people say global, the deindustrialization that came out of the a race to the bottom in global wages is a bad thing. They don't like that. You saw that, you see that in the United Kingdom, where you had a working class and in that country that was fed up with the European Union. And you saw labor, you know, pivot more towards the sensibilities of wealthier, more urban voters instead of the base of the working class in that country, right? So that's a real fundamental tension, I think, between liberal and socialist politics. that we're seeing. I think that the lie of globalization as the engine of the problem is, something that the right wing utilizes because they can't talk class politics. The liberals are timid, to be able to speak to that because they don't want to do class politics. And I think it's important to be able to clearly delineate between the kind of nativism that you get from the right on these things, um, and kind of socialist politics, if that makes sense. I think summed up rather well by R.T. Wager, who says Bernie campaign both grew the left and disillusioned the left. It grew the left, and that is good. It grew the left because for the vast majority of the left was not something they knew existed. Now they see it something that could be, and I think that's very much how I feel about it. I think it was a good process to go through, but I think a lot of the lessons haven't been learned, and I think it's also provided some bad habits. But I would much rather be in a situation where there's a left to be fighting about and talking about and trying to build, versus what it was very much pre-Bernie, which was, very much a non-factor in American politics, at least. Organizing your country and reining in corporations is the most solidarity you can show for your fellow workers abroad, especially here in the United States. And I definitely agree with that. I'm sorry. What's our Twitch doesn't have any color on it? I feel bad for our Twitch viewers sometimes. We don't mean to neglect y'all. I will figure out what you mean there, and I will try to make it more attractive to folks so they know when we're online. Atomic Punk says, Griscom, what do you see as more plausible, that a left wing candidate reaches the White House as president, or the independence of Texas if the crisis in the United States deteriorates? The likelihood of Texas um, becoming independent, I think, is limited. If anything, the power that they have within the Republican Party, like I'm talking about the state GOP here, and then the National Republican Party, is only going to allow for increased states' rights before separating from the U.S. The thing is, like, economically, Texas leaving the union would just be like drop all the other concerns, right? Just on that level, it would just be disastrous. Texas is a vibrant economy. It's a brutal one, but people make a lot of money here, and they make money here because it's situated quite well in the United States financial and economic system, and you can't pull out from that. And maintain the level of wealth that's enjoyed by the ruling class here. So I think the rhetoric will never go away, um, but like the actual threat of it is very low. So being optimistic too, I think that getting a left winger in the White House will be more likely than that. And our friend RT over here is just taking the words out of my mouth. Texas wouldn't secede because it's one of the fake populist things. Everyone knows the U.S. government creates favorable situation for business in the state, and that's exactly it. Appreciate our friend from Australia. Have a good day at work. I'm not saying the curse word on the show. Joe says, what if we focus on just getting DSA jacked? If we're yoked enough, surely the bourgeoisie can't stop us. They don't even lift. I'll let you, command the army of Swoletariat friends, Joe. You're definitely the man to do it. Have we thought about talking with the other socialist people on YouTube? I don't know these folks. I don't think, but I mean, we do. We're always, we have a guest on every week, so I think we might get some of our European friends on soon. We're planning on reaching out, but like I'm generally happy. I try not to do like internet left drama stuff, so I'm not really interested in doing like debate stuff with folks. But I'm definitely happy to have people on and doing conversations and covering topics with people. Um, I think we do it. We've had like Lance of the Surfs on. We obviously have Ben and our friends at TIR on all the time. But I'm always happy to hear more suggestions. I don't know these two folks that you suggested, but I'll check them out. Also, I'm going to take a few more. I appreciate it's you know I hope this is interesting for folks. I know it was a little rambly, but it's just where complicated subjects sometimes to get into, and sometimes not as easy to do if you're just going. Maybe if I had maybe I should do this with somebody else in the future. But I'm going to be, I'll be back in just a little bit with our friends at TIR for our twice monthly cross stream. So I'll be with Matt and Jason and Pascal in just 3 hours at 8 Central. So if you're not done with me yet, we can have a little bit more. My friend Connor from Kentucky says, as a former guest, I can tell you all David eats is caviar and reads Forbes magazine off air. Sure. Was I doing that? Strom says neoliberal globalization, among other things, is the pitting of proletariats against each other in a race to the bottom. I think that's right to say it. Sam says, how's the weather in Texas? It's been nice, man. It's like this is the beautiful time of year when it's still a little sunny, but it's nice, like 60s. I've been happy. Yeah, we're going to be joining our friends at This Is Revolution for our cross stream. Cool. You and me having the same realization this morning. It's Thursday. Yep. All right. Let's see. I think I might run. Luke wants to know if I've ever done psychedelics. Not really my thing. Would they be useful in having people break from catalyst ideology? I hate to say I don't think so. I could have this. I think Varn would be somebody who I could definitely have this conversation with. Do I know Sean KB? If I don't, I'd love to know who that is. It's not ringing a bell. But anyways, folks, I mean, if you're looking for things to read, I know people do like suggestions. I think if you want to have a good understanding of recent history, I think Sam Gindens and Leo Panich, I know I suggest this almost every stream, book, The Social Challenge Today, is excellent. I think it really looks at some of these fundamental problems. Oh, Sean from As a Worker. I've been saying to Matt, I want to get him on the podcast for a long time. No, I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan. I definitely like to get Sean on. That's actually something that been meaning to do for a long time, and I actually feel a little bad that we haven't. So that's a great idea. Maybe we could do that with him soon. But anyways, Sam Gideon, Leo Panich, Socialist Challenge Today. Is an excellent book to sort of look at some of this recent history. If you have been following and reading the work of Anton Jaeger, who you can read in Jacobin and in other fine publications, including Catalyst, and you can listen to them on podcasts and YouTube interviews and things like that. That's somebody who writes a lot about populism, whose work I think is indispensable, frankly. A lot of focus on the European side, but the stuff, I think it crosses a lot of borders. And yeah, so I'll be back in a couple hours with our friends at TR for our cross stream. You can watch it right here on this channel. I think we're going to be talking. We had to reshuffle our guests, so I can't remember what's coming up this Sunday, but we have a Sunday show we're recording tomorrow. it will be out for patrons. You can sign up at patreon.com/leftreckoning. Next week, I don't want to announce it yet, but we're going to have some interesting guests on the program. Should be a lot of fun, a little bit different from what we normally do. So keep your eye out for that, Tuesday at 7 Central. And don't forget, we're going to be at the Cutting Room in New York City on January 22nd. Me, Matt Leck, Jason Miles, Ben Burgess, Sam Cedar, Emma Vigland, and Bhaskar Sankara. It's going to be a hell of a lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to that. We had a great time in LA, and I'm really looking forward to New York. So you can get your tickets now. And yeah, come see us. And until then, everybody, I'll be back in just a couple hours with our friends at TIR. Take care.